Okay, so the series of talks is more about careers than anything. I know, Dante, you could speak about so many different things from conservation and biology to caves and deep sea life and all that. But I think I try to invite people to come and speak that I admire, people that I know that the students would admire and that they would love to have your job. And so the idea is for them to really try to understand actually what is your job. And because a lot of times people think they have an idea about those posters like what people think I do, what my family thinks I do, what
Oh
I
yeah,
think I do. It's kind of like
sure,
that, right?
sure, sure.
And so that's kind of the point of the talks is we're a really small school. Students don't get a lot of exposure to different people. We don't have graduate students. We don't have a ton of professors. So I think they kind of suffer from the lack of exposure about what really is possible when they leave here. And, I think that makes it hard to get motivated sometimes to do the hard work while you're in your degree. So,
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
um,
Sure. Sure. Sure.
so I know you said you grew up in California, right?
I did. I grew up in the Bay Area of California.
Okay.
I grew up doing this kind of thing. Um,
Okay.
so I had a dad who owned a company that imported aquarium fish from all over the world, freshwater
Okay.
and marine. He had a couple of his own collection stations in Indo-Pacific. Um, and he was actually one of the first people to make a lot of noise about not supporting a collection of marine fish that are either dynamite collected or cyanide collected, which are both practices that exist to today. And all of his fish were hand collected.
Mm.
But he made a lot of noise about it and was really one of the first people to raise alarm flags for those collection methods because, like dynamite collecting, you just go over a reef and you light a stick of dynamite and you drop it down in the water with some weights, and the explosion shocks fish, and they'll obviously it's very destructive. So it destroys the reef in the course of doing all of this, as if reefs are infinite resources, and obviously they're finite. So it
Right.
was a bad collection method. But anyway, I grew up with a dad doing all of that, and one of the things that really impacted my career was the fact that um, he told all of his business partners around the world and colleagues that he had a kid that liked frogs. So little bags of gift frogs started showing up in the fish boxes.
Live
And
frog?
I had things from Colombia and Venezuela and Brazil and Peru and Ecuador and even Chile um, that nobody else had. Back in those days, there wasn't an internet and there
Mm.
weren't readily available information sources. So I had to teach myself how to culture fruit flies and feed poison frogs. And ironically, I had a couple species of poison frog that I was breeding as a kid, 7 or 8 years old, that not only didn't have scientific names at that time, never got scientific names. The forests that they came from were entirely wiped out before they were ever described.
Wow.
So I also, and the reason I bring all this up though, my dad had a partner or a colleague in Chile who was sending things up. And I had a group of Darwin's frogs to work with as a kid. And your students may or may not know the unique evolutionary trajectory of that lineage, but there's only two species of frogs on Earth that raise their young in their vocal sac. So the male will take newly hatching tadpoles into his mouth, slip them below his tongue through the vocal slit and into his vocal sac, and they will develop there for the next 65 to 85 days. It's a temperature dependent process. And once those frogs have completely gone through metamorphosis in his body, he will cough up fully formed miniatures of himself one at a time until he's expelled all of them. And That's the genus Rhinoderma. One of the two species is presumed extinct already, but I bred those as a kid, multiple generations. And ironically enough, they were not endangered then. They are endangered now. I run a huge conservation initiative in Chile where we work with endangered Chilean amphibians, including Darwin's frogs. But I cheated a little bit when we built our first labs. I started with Darwin's frogs because I knew I could breed them. I knew how to do it. So, and I knew we needed a quick win and we needed a lot of media attention. And I think at that point I had raised something like $50,000 or $60,000 for the project. With all of the media attention that we got from that, in the next year we raised another 300,000. So as a conservation biologist, you need to know how to play the cards, and things like media attention are really important.
Yeah, so there's a lot of soft skills, a lot of you've got to be able to speak. You have to know how to shake
Absolutely.
somebody's hand, and I mean, that I think a lot of people. I remember we had a veterinarian come in, and he said a lot of people want to become a veterinarian because they don't like people, and he said, "Well, the dogs don't pay you, and so you do anything you do, you can't avoid working with people. I think for sure."
And that is absolutely the case here. I cannot emphasize that enough, that um, the skill sets that I use daily, I never was taught in grad school. And I wish that I had a couple courses where they say, oh, maybe you don't want to become a university professor. And working at a not-for-profit, it's nothing like working at a university, and being able to give a good presentation and really hold attention. That is everything, because you're dealing with people from the general public, donors, board members, guests. All of those things were skills. I was lucky because in grad school I had the opportunity to do a lot of that.
Okay.
But I was not taught that. I was giving talks on captive husbandry of amphibians when I was a little kid. So I learned by making a lot of mistakes, and I learned by watching people that I thought were giving really good talks and emulating them. But grad school did not do me any favors that way. And I'm not complaining. I had great graduate school experiences, both at the University of Oklahoma and the University of Miami. But they were assuming that I wanted to move on and become a university professor. And that's a really weird assumption nowadays, because most jobs in biology are not with universities.
Right. Yeah, no, it's true. And I would say it's not the best industry to go into these days either. So where
It
did
changed, as you well know.
when you were a student, how serious did you take your classes? How involved were you on campus? You could take yourself back to undergrad. Were you
Sure.
just 100% laser focused at that time?
At that time I was. So but let me explain what the circumstances were. It was a little different for me. I had not paid a lot of attention through school when I was in high school. I had it was a weird mismatch. I would get bored really easy in class, and that leads to just not good things in class.
Yeah.
So I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, and I sort of meandered through high school with okay grades but not great grades. And then all of a sudden at the end of high school, all of my friends went off to college and I didn't. And so I immediately became very serious about school. I loved the college atmosphere a little. The classrooms obviously are just different from high school, and thrived. I went to the University of California at Santa Cruz, and I got degrees in biology and in environmental studies. All of that was great, but I had to sort of fight my way from the start, because I hadn't done academically great in high school.
Okay. Yeah.
I did ended up doing really well through my undergrad program and through my graduate programs, but that's because I was taking it seriously.
Yeah, you had that passion already, thanks to your dad, sounds like.
Absolutely. Yeah, I knew what I was interested in. I had just squandered opportunities in high school, played a lot of sports, did a lot of things that didn't, I surfed a lot. That didn't do me any favors. The truancy officer knew exactly who I was. And, anyway, I didn't take a lot of it seriously and should have. So I don't recommend that pathway to anybody because
Well, yeah.
you got
I
to fight
mean,
your way up then.
yeah, you got caught up, and then at the end of your undergrad, was it clear you wanted to go to grad school?
Yes, I knew from the outset. And this is a really important thing that when I advise students, I really try to emphasize. A lot of students assume they need to go to graduate school or will go to grad school not really knowing why they know the degree. And absolutely positively, that is not the thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I would advise any student to say, okay, what is my end game goal? Because graduate school is not an end game. Graduate school is a stepping stone.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to ask yourself at the outset, what is it that I want to do?
Mm-hmm.
And then once you can answer that question, you want to identify, say, half a dozen or 10 people that are successful in that field, that are doing the thing that you want to do. And I would encourage all of the students to go out, reach out to those people. You're going to get some that don't respond, cool, but you'll get some that do. And you want to ask questions like, what kind of a degree do you need to do what you do? What kind of accessory things do you need to have on your CV to be attractive to get into a program like that?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kinds of things that I think you need to ask in advance, right? And then go ahead and say, okay, for the job that I need, do I need a PhD? A lot of times you don't. To become a state wildlife biologist,
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of circumstances, not all, but a lot, a master's degree is adequate. And in some cases, you don't need that. So I would always recommend that people be really clear about what their end game goal is, outline what you need to get there based on your interviews of people that are there, and only go that far. And the reason I bring this up, I can't tell you how many people I was in grad programs with that couldn't tell me why they needed why they were doing what they were doing.
Yeah. Yep.
And of course, that accounts for the 60 or some odd percent dropout rate in grad school, biological grad school.
Yep.
They start and realize that they didn't need it, or it's harder than they thought, or they didn't really have a clear direction. And I can't tell you how many people started and just vanished between semesters.
Yeah, you got to know the why, right? It's the intentionality.
You do.
I think
You
the
do.
mentoring that's so critical. So a lot of our students do think they want to work in a zoo. I think partly because when they sit down and they say, I like animals, and they're trying to envision where do people work with animals, it's a zoo. So what can you say about, what type of training should they try to plan for? Is an undergrad degree sufficient? And then are there a lot of jobs at a zoo that are sort of long-term sustainable jobs that you can make the kind of money you want to have a decent life?
Okay. So my take in 10 years with the zoo and 5 years at a public botanical garden, there are a lot of sustainable jobs, right?
Okay.
And it's a growing field. I think zoos and aquariums across the world have realized that this next generation doesn't put up with having animals in captivity unless they stand for something, unless they represent something, right? And so zoos and aquariums are on an increasing basis stepping into conservation and education, right? Both of which are critical, because if we can't educate the general public and we can't interface with the general public, we're not going to change public opinions. And the public is where the battle will be won or lost, right? I mean, that's where the masses are. That's where the money is. You need to be able to influence the public. Now, one advantage that zoos and aquariums have over any other kind of stakeholder in conservation, no stakeholder has the interface with the general public like zoos and aquariums. Of roughly 800 million people a year visit zoos and aquariums. That's more than all professional sporting events combined in the US each year.
Really?
So it's huge, right? That's a huge interface. No other stakeholder can do that. So a good zoo and aquarium with really good signage, a really good education and outreach program, and a really good conservation program, those are the institutions that are quite literally stepping in and saving species. When I say save species, the list of species that have quite literally existed only because a zoo or an aquarium stepped in is a growing one. And it's a long one. And the animal rights activists a lot of times will ignore that and say, oh, they say they're doing conservation, but they're not. Start with the American bison. If the Bronx Zoological Society hadn't stepped in, you would only know about them in the books covering extinction. And there are a lot of species now that are joining that list. And sadly, what's even more complicated, genetic diversity now is more represented in zoo and aquarium collections than in wild populations. That is also becoming very, very common. And then you have an even more convoluted problem. Sometimes you have captive populations of things where the wild, not only are the wild populations gone, but the habitat is gone. So even if you bred them in captivity, you don't have anywhere to put them because quite literally the physical habitat is missing. And I don't even know what that's called. Curation, maybe, but it's a complicated but increasingly common problem, particularly with species that started with a very small range and a very small population base to begin with. So a lot of the species I work with in subterranean environments are like that. You have single site endemics that aren't known from any other system, and something happens, some surface activity or a mining activity, and the physical habitat is gone or contaminated. You're left curating something that doesn't exist in the wild anymore, nor does its habitat. So, but my point is, jobs at zoos and aquariums are increasing, not decreasing. And a lot of zoos and aquariums are getting very serious about developing brand new departments of conservation and research. I was hired 10 years ago by the San Antonio Zoo to develop the Center for Conservation and Research from scratch. They did not have a self-standing program. They supported conservation initiatives financially, but they didn't have at the time a conservation program. And so I was brought in to build one from scratch. So it is a viable for sure. Now, one thing I want to say to all of your students to make it abundantly clear, you're not going to get rich working at a zoo or an aquarium, right? So financial compensation is probably on par with a small university job.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
I can relate to that.
I think we both can. Yeah.
And I try, when I was young, I thought, well, $30,000 is so much money, but I try to get people thinking about like, well, what's your intention for your life? And, there's a certain critical mass that you need to be over to be able to have housing and, be able to have a family if you want to. And go to a lot of misconceptions about grad school, about how expensive it's going to be. But if you play your cards right, it should be at least revenue neutral, And so do you think, another lesson I've tried to convey to my students is that the classes is just one part of your degree here. You really have to supplement that with things you do during the summer or with, attending meetings, making contacts and things. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. The other piece of advice that I like to try to give students, I have a lot of students that write to me and say, hey, I'm really interested in what you do. And ultimately I'd like to take a career that direction. A couple general principles, because I don't want to turn any students off, but I also don't want to misrepresent anything. This is a hard way to make a living. The job owns you. So for probably the better part of almost 10 years, I was traveling 7 to 10 months a year. So, and I was married. So, not a good way to keep a family together, a pretty good recipe for a divorce. If you're young and single, this is a great job, believe me. But in most circumstances, that condition ends, right? Somebody meets somebody else and you end up with a family. It's really challenging that way. And work-life balance is critically important. And you have to carve that out because trust me, an institution will take everything you give and then ask for more.
Right.
So that is sort of lesson number one. Lesson number two, if you want to head this direction, it is incredibly competitive. There are a lot of folks who want to do this kind of thing. you want to make sure that you immerse yourself in activities that will help you build your CV.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I was a kid, I probably bred 40 or 50 species of amphibians, many for the first time ever. I had a frog room that my parents literally made for me because I got into it that much. But because I published on some of that, even as a kid, it gave me a huge leg up on other folks. And I had publications, literally had peer review publications before I got into an undergraduate program.
Mm-hmm.
So that just being aggressive about CV building is really important. If you can find somebody in a lab who will let you take part in a research study before you take part in that, ask the hard questions. If I do a good job here, would you be willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation? That's a real good question, and make sure to preface that strong letter of recommendation, not just letter of recommendation. You want to make sure you get out of it what you put into it, but anything you can do, field studies that you can participate in, university projects that you can participate in. If you can join a Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, any of those groups doing annual bird counts where it's done systematically. Any kind of project that you can bolster your CV with are things that people look for. And let me assure you, because I've sat on plenty of the committees, having a good GPA is not going to get you. It's not going to just get you. That alone is not going to get you into a good grad program, and it's not going to get you a job. Mm-hmm. Everybody has a 4.0. And I hate to say that. Newsflash: if you want to get into a really competitive field, a really good GPA is sort of like a prerequisite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you have to make yourself stand out to be competitive. So you need to be very, very aggressive at the earliest possible stage about this. And the more stuff real stuff that you can put on your CV, the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. And I did not pay Dante to say any of that, for the record. But it's true.
I was not paid in any way for that statement. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I see it time and time again, and so it's important for people to hear it. So, okay, so tell me something that you've done recently that you're really proud of at your job.
Okay, so I'll go with one of our key conservation programs that's in the Peruvian Amazon. So one of the other things that I was lucky enough to do when I was in high school, when I was just a kid, I met a biologist who was working in the Amazon basin doing a lot of reptile and amphibian work. And as high school wound down, I started spending my summers working for him in the Amazon basin, assisting with these surveys. And a lot of times I found myself out on the land of indigenous communities. Mm. And I made friends, right? I mean, these were people that were incredibly fascinating to me. Nobody knows the forest better than someone living there. Mm. And just everything about the way they talk, the way they think, the way they view wildlife, it is so remarkably different from the West. It just captivated me, but it drew me into these lifelong friendships. And ultimately, those friendships led to some real brass tacks conversations, because I was well aware of the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars have been poured into conservation efforts in Latin America to save the rainforests under that general umbrella, with very, very little to show for it. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know why it doesn't work. And I didn't want to tell them why it doesn't work. I don't know. They know. They've seen it. Mm-hmm. So a lot of conversations led to my understanding from their side of the fence. And again, these are the people I respect as the ultimate holders of knowledge with regard to rainforest dynamics and wildlife. I mean, they live there, and they have for many generations and centuries. So I respected anything that they had to say. And what I took from it was they're fine for food, housing, transportation. They've been doing just fine for a lot longer than Westerners have been around. Where things get dicey now, cash is in short supply in the Amazon. And if they need Western medical attention or medicine, they've got to pay for it. And that's where you get indigenous communities getting into a bind, where they'll sell logging rights, mineral rights, oil extraction rights, because there's a community emergency. Mm-hmm. And so I started asking questions. Well, you guys know me, and I want to support you, because you're basically a childhood at this point. How can I support you? What system could we set up that's different from what's been tried? And so through many more conversations, we ironed out what is now Project Selva. And basically what we do is we create a sustainable revenue stream for indigenous communities. We have an office in the Amazonian city of Iquitos. We have a team that we pay. We have a boat so that they can visit these remote indigenous communities that all want to keep and retain stands of rainforest on their traditional lands. Now, the preservation of those stands of rainforest is exactly what we're after. As the zoo and as the Center for Conservation and Research, we care about that unbelievable and unparalleled biodiversity living in those forests and the long-term maintenance of those forests. But you can't do it working against the people that live there. You have to work with the people that live there and include them. So I let them develop the model. I didn't develop it, they did. So what we agreed on, they carve little balsa wood animals, tortoises and freshwater dolphins and tapirs and monkeys and sloths and things like that out of balsa wood. Balsa is a non-threatened rainforest tree. It grows like a weed. In about a year and a half, you can have a large tree that you could carve many of these animals from. The other added benefit to balsa wood is it's a very light wood. So I can go down there and I can pack hundreds of these up in a suitcase, bring them back, and we can sell them in our gift stores to help offset some of the cost to this project. Now, the one thing that immediately became apparent was the fact that the sale of trinkets in a gift store isn't going to pay for a project like this, right? I mean, it's really expensive. So I asked myself, what is it we're trying to celebrate in the Amazon? And clearly it was biodiversity. And then I asked myself, okay, fine, what aspect of the biodiversity in the upper Amazon basin really stands out? Well, it's biodiversity in freshwater fishes. There are more species of freshwater fish in the upper Amazon basin than any other corner of the planet. We're at about 2,300 to 2,500 species right now. Most taxonomists think that, by the time all the assessments are done, we'll be well north of 5,000 species. And that's freshwater fish alone. So it's an incredibly biodiverse region. And then I asked myself, okay, fine, is there a culture around the world somewhere that celebrates fish in a way that we could use to raise funds? And I immediately thought of Japan and the Japanese form of fish printing, and it's called gyutaku. And so they take the fish, a dead fish, they ink it, they press a piece of rice paper against that animal, pull it back, and you have an exact replica of the fish that was there. And then that originally started in Japan as a means for recording, a fisherman recording his catch. This is way before photography and cameras and cell phones and all of that. But then it, over hundreds of years, turned into this amazing, beautiful art form where people will go back and paint in the fish and paint in their eyes and turn them into these beautiful pieces of art. So what we did is we said, this is what we want. We built an art studio into our office in Iquitos. We found half a dozen very excited and eager to learn young Peruvians in the city of Iquitos. I flew in a gyutaku artist to the Amazonian city of Iquitos, and we started giving lessons to these young artists in Japanese fish printing using Amazonian fishes. So we would go down to the fish market in the morning, we would pick up some fishes, we'd bring them back, and then they would spend the entire day learning how to do this. Well, fast forward through multiple training sessions with different artists, and our Peruvian artists got really good at this. And so they began cranking out fish prints, and we can bring those up and we can sell them to help offset the costs. Now, the other way to keep a program like this sustainable, and this is something I talk about a lot, particularly with college students, you have to think about building a conservation program to last. You cannot think of the short term. You have to think of the long term. And the long-term stability of a project relies on multiple partner organizations. You cannot hang it on one individual. You cannot hang it on one institution, because that inherently bleeds instability. So we started picking up partner organizations. The Roger Williams Park Zoo in Rhode Island is a partner to this. The Moody Gardens outside of Houston is now a partner to this. We have a small reptile and amphibian museum up the road from us, Snake Farm. They are now a part of this. Texas A&M San Antonio is now a part of this. And all those things lead to more collaborations and opportunities for students and things like that. But the best way to build a conservation program to last is to make sure that you have multiple partners, multiple institutions. Here's the bottom line. If I go out tomorrow and I get hit by a Mack truck, I don't want any of these projects to end. That's not real conservation. They have to keep going into the future without me. And even if my institution dropped out, the same thing stands. The project needs to be able to last. So those are the pillars that you can put underneath a conservation project to make it last. Now, one last note on this. When COVID hit, another big revenue stream for these indigenous communities, it's ecotourism. Tourists visiting the village and paying to see them dance and do local customs and selling knickknacks. That's a big piece of this. And all of a sudden there were no tourists, and nobody from the Peruvian government showed up at these remote indigenous communities to tell them what was going on. They learned about it from our people visiting to pick up these knickknacks. And then after a few months, it became abundantly apparent they were in real trouble. They didn't have gardens big enough to sustain their communities. They weren't able to catch enough fish to sustain their communities. And a lot of very, very serious issues started to develop. And one of the things I'm most proud of, to answer your initial question, I went to my boss, the CEO of the zoo here, Tim Morrow, and I said, hey, these communities that I feel are family to me are now quite literally facing starvation. At the time, our gates were closed. We weren't open. And rather than turtle and just say, well, they're on their own, instead, our CEO said, you come up with a budget. You tell me what we need to do per month to support our conservation partners. Wow. And I did. And to this day, every month, it's a two-way trip. When our team from our office in Iquitos goes out in our boat to these remote communities, they bring food, water, and medicine, and then we buy the trinkets and take those back, and we export them to the States. So my point in bringing all this up is that if you enter into a conservation partnership, you need to be willing to go to the mat for that. Don't do it lightheartedly. Don't do it, without being absolutely invested. You have to do it with 100% intentions to do whatever you need to do to make these things continue. And that is one example of something I'm very proud of. My institution stood up for the right thing when they had to, and when we didn't have money coming in.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the reason it's been successful because you made the project not about you. It was about those folks. And so if you dip out, it continues on. And so I think it's amazing, man. That's really very inspiring. And
well, you just made a really important point that I want your students to soak up like a sponge. Conservation is never about the biologist leading the project. Okay. And the second it becomes that, and trust me, it does all the time, all you need to do is turn on TV. The second it goes that route, it is inherently unstable again because it's not about the thing you're trying to save. So none of the work we do is about me. None of the work we do is about any of my team members. It's not about the zoo. It's about trying to keep something around so the next generations can enjoy it. And I thank you very much for bringing up that point, because I cannot tell you how many good, well-intentioned folks that I've watched lose their way, and all of a sudden it becomes an ego thing, and I need to do this because I've got a TV show, or I need to do this because I've got this podcast, or I've got this website that I've got to feed, or it becomes just a raw ego thing, feeding a Facebook page. And it can't ever turn into that.
Yeah, it's not fair to the folks who are supposedly helping, because then the person gets a job somewhere else, and along with them goes that entire project. And then those people who maybe come to depend on that assistance, So, and again, I think it's interesting. Full circle. Ultimately, the thing that brought you into this was the frogs and the fish, but in the end, it's about the people, right? And
absolutely,
conservation is about people. It's got to be, because they're the ones that are on the ground.
Boy, it sure is.
Yeah.
I almost wish I had a degree in psychology, because the irony is, if you asked 100 biologists if they got into it because they wanted to deal with people. I guarantee you over 90 of them would say, no, it's because I want to work with my study organism or my study system or whatever it is. But the truth is, in conservation, it is 99% about people.
Yeah.
And if you can't get up and give a good presentation, look people in the eye, shake their hand, speak, with good information behind what you're saying. One of the tenets at the university level, particularly, I was thankfully this was hammered into my brain at OU when I started as a first year grad student. Do not ever get out in front of students and BS your way through anything. Inevitably, you will have somebody call you on it in a very, very embarrassing way. If
Yeah.
you don't know, learn how to say, I'll get back to you. I don't know. It's hugely valuable. And the same goes for this here. You really have to know your limits and your boundaries. You have to know when you're communicating with people, when it's time to say, I don't have an answer to that question, or science doesn't yet have an answer to that question. The conservation community is still struggling with that. But if we take these steps, we're hopeful we can get here, a little bit closer to an answer. So knowing when to say when is really, really important in this job.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So, well, Dante, I really appreciate your time, man. I admire what you do, and
No
I
problem.
thank you for the messages for the students. And I'm going to post this, and I know that there are several students that will watch this, and um, they may be knocking at your door trying to get some advice. So, I thanks for taking your time.
I'm always happy to do it. Yeah, always happy to do that. And for your students, your professor is an old friend of mine, and I'm honored to have been asked to do this. This is one of those jobs where you should take it understanding that it will own you. And the thing is, at least in my mind, I drew a line in the sand, and I wanted to stand up for the exact thing that gave me so much as a kid. If I didn't stand by biodiversity, and biodiversity literally turned me into who I was. I mean, I spent my childhood fishing and hunting and camping with my father and my grandfather. Most of my childhood was spent out in the woods, and much of my adult life has been, what kind of a person would I be if I turned my back on it? So, but I just want to emphasize, you have to be willing to dedicate yourself to this, because this is not a 9 to 5 job remotely. Yeah.
I think that's true. So good.
Yeah.
All right, Dante, we'll take good care of yourself.
All right.
And
Thank you
we'll
for
talk to you
the
again
time and the
soon.
opportunity to talk to the students.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Sounds good. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.